there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author, editor, and longtime anime fan, and welcome to Let's Write With, the series where we use the power of anime to become better writers. If you're tired of high-level writing advice that doesn't do much other than tell you that said is dead, you're in the right place. In this series, we take a more organic approach by looking at what other writers are doing, stealing their good ideas, and hopefully figuring out how to avoid their mistakes. Today we're going to do that by looking at a shounen anime called Noragami, but we're going to do it a little differently than we have some of the other titles in this series. We're going to discuss Noragami through the lens of a very common anime archetype, the trickster, and take a look at how that affects various aspects of the storytelling. If you're not sure what the trickster archetype is, fear not, we'll be getting into that in just a moment. But first, let's do a little housekeeping. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the Noragami anime and not the manga. There's actually a reason for this, aside from just keeping things simple, and that is that I want to talk specifically about how not having certain information from the manga affects how things play out in the anime. Additionally, here is your spoiler warning for all 25 episodes of the anime. And just as a heads up, alongside the usual fantasy violence, there are actually some darker themes in this anime, including emotional abuse. I'm not going to be showing any R-rated clips or anything, but I am going to talk about how that abuse affects several of the main characters, so please just keep that in mind if you watch this video or the original series. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk story. Noragami, sometimes translated as Stray God, began as a shonen manga by a duo of artists writing under the pen name Adachi Toka. It ran in Kodansha's monthly shonen magazine from 2010 until its recent conclusion in January of 2024. Between 2014 and 2015, Noragami got a 2-season anime adaptation covering the first several story arcs. While it heavily teased a third season, as of 2024, no additional seasons have been made. Noragami follows the story of Hiyori Ito, a 15-year-old schoolgirl who one day happens to save a guy from getting run over by a truck. Thing is, the situation isn't quite what it seems. The young man is actually Yato, a minor god who's been doing a bunch of odd jobs to raise enough cash to build himself a shrine, essentially all that stands between him and being forgotten and thereby ceasing to exist. Hiyori's intervention is cute, but no big deal to him since, as a god, he was never really in danger. However, it's a much bigger deal to Hiyori because it's somehow causing her soul to periodically untether from her body, and if she stays like this too long, she'll die. Hiyori manages to get the very goofy and unreliable Yato to agree to help her. But in order for Yato to fulfill that request, they're going to have to find a way to work together to beat back the mystical dangers that are bleeding into the human world. In this video, we're going to look at 3 different story elements and try to pick apart how they're working or not working and what we can take away to help with our own writing. And we're going to do that by looking at the trickster archetype as embodied by Yato and considering how it can both complement and complicate the story. We'll be discussing archetypes versus tropes, character, and backstory. Archetypes versus tropes. Even if you haven't heard of archetypes, you're probably at least a little familiar with the idea of tropes. And since there's a fair amount of overlap between the two, let's start with some definitions so we're all on the same page.
Trope.
TV Tropes defines a trope as a conceptual figure of speech, a storytelling shorthand for a concept that the audience will recognize and understand instantly. You might have heard of tropes in the context of familiar storytelling concepts like enemies to lovers or the double cross. A trope is basically a storytelling concept that we're all really familiar with seeing, although the way it plays out may differ depending on the story. Authors and readers often use tropes to quickly explain who they think might enjoy their story. For example, someone might say, "This is a good story for people who enjoy found family," by which they mean this is a book that might appeal to readers who enjoy a diverse cast who come together to form a close-knit group that resembles a family. Archetype. An archetype is defined by TV Tropes as a universal theme, story, or character that is so fundamental that regardless of how many times it is used, it never becomes stale, dated, or cliché. I'd argue that the main difference between a trope and an archetype is that an archetype usually involves a theme as embodied by a character who sort of exists within the collective unconscious, so like a hero or a mentor. Compare this to a trope, which is usually just shorthand for a general storytelling concept. But even if we use those definitions, you can see that there's a fair amount of overlap. The cliche thing in the archetype definition is really interesting because this is a common misconception, I think, when it comes to tropes and archetypes. Some folks hesitate to even reference tropes because they're afraid that they're leaning into oversimplification or even stereotypes. I actually talked a little bit about this in my video on the first season of Tower of God, but short version, I think it can actually be really useful to lean into the tropes that are associated with your genre. This can be a really good way to draw in the really dedicated readers. The important thing to keep in mind here is that tropes and archetypes aren't inherently good or evil. They're just one way of talking about the way we've told stories for millennia and are likely to continue telling them in the future. They can also be really fun to read and write, and the trickster is one of my favorites.
The trickster.
Okay, so what exactly is the trickster archetype, and why are we focusing a whole video on it? Wikipedia describes the traditional mythological trickster as a character who exhibits a great degree of intellect or secret knowledge and uses it to play tricks or otherwise disobey normal rules and defy conventional behavior. The trickster archetype is really common in anime, and it comes in a variety of flavors. But it usually involves a character who maintains some sort of goofball facade in order to hide their real personality and intentions. This puts them in a position to say and do things that other characters can't. Yato, our titular stray god, falls into a category that overly sarcastic productions refers to as crouching moron, hidden badass. These are your Kenshin Himuras and Vasha Stampedes, characters who seem very goofy and innocuous, even to the point where people wildly underestimate them, until the moment when their back is against the wall, at which point they become total badasses. This is often used as a coping mechanism for a dark and mysterious past that the character is trying to put behind them. Purpose. There are actually quite a few reasons why a trickster character might be an asset to your story. Let's use Yato as an example to point out some of the possibilities. Truth to power. Yato is an outsider, someone who's seen as unpleasant and unworthy of being a god. Other gods and spirits are constantly making fun of his lack of fashion sense and the fact that he basically has no power and has to sleep in other gods' shrines. But because he's an outsider, Yato is able to appreciate things that the other gods take for granted, like having followers and a place to be worshipped. He's also been known to, shall we say, ignore the etiquette of the far shore or land of the gods. For example, we learn that at one point in the past, when the war god Bishamon was in trouble, Yato was the one who answered the desperate call of her servant Kazuma. Yato's violent solution fit who he was at the time, but it didn't really go down well with his peers. Gods don't usually go around killing other gods' servants, after all. However, it did end up saving Bishamon's life. And it led to him becoming her enemy for thousands of years, but we'll come back to that. Point is, Yato is a trickster who, in some ways, exists outside the rules and regulations that are usually found on the far shore, which means that he can say and do things that other characters can't. Subverting expectations. This is really the crux of the trickster character. They subvert other characters and the audience's expectations. This is particularly true of the crouching moron, hidden badass variety. These characters are so goofy that it comes as a complete shock when they get serious. Yato shifts back and forth from a dorky loser who keeps wasting his money to a cold, confident god of calamity who's a real force to be reckoned with. Additionally, he's a character who struggles to accept his past as a killer while also trying to figure out what kind of god he wants to be in the future, and if that kind of change is even possible. If you've ever had to write a high school English paper, you've probably had to support a thesis that goes something like, character X is not what they seem. This is a common idea in fiction, one might even call it a trope, because it creates an immediate connection between the reader and the character. I suspect we've all had situations where someone didn't take us seriously or underestimated what we're capable of. That can make for a solid bond between the reader and a trickster character like Yato. We know he's more than he seems, but the others don't. Until they do, which can make for some really excellent entertainment. Complexity. All of these aspects of a trickster can lead to a complex character with many layers. For example, a trickster can combine elements of comedy, misdirection, and badassery to become more than each of these individual elements. Tricksters like Yato aren't just comedic relief characters, and they aren't just badasses. Their personalities, skills, and histories make them complicated characters who can be both endearing and terrifying. And it's that complexity that makes Yato a great foil for characters like Hiyori, who has a more down-to-earth human view of the world, and characters like Yukine, Yato's servant or regalia, who deals with his past trauma in a much more overtly destructive way. When someone misunderstands or underestimates Yato, or when he's just acting like a dork instead of the badass we know he can be, it elicits an emotional response from the audience. Now, your mileage may vary in terms of whether or not you like Yato, but in more general terms, the appeal of this kind of character is the audience wanting to see them really lay into the people who underestimated them or threaten the people they care about. We like to see characters who upset norms and expectations, and that's exactly what tricksters are designed to do. Writing takeaways on archetypes versus tropes. 1. Tropes and archetypes are both variations on a concept, one character or storytelling element broken down in a way that makes it more easily accessible to the audience. You might worry that this makes them cliches or lazy writing, but that doesn't need to be the case. It's all in how you use them. 2. The trickster is an age-old archetype that often refers to a character who balances silliness and incompetence with a tragic backstory. They're pretty easy to spot in anime and can provide a lot of much-needed humor, conflict, and character development that goes beyond just that guy's a dork or that gal has a mysterious past. 3. A trickster who's also an outsider offers an interesting opportunity for commentary on other characters and the world at large from someone with nothing to lose. A trickster can shake things up and call it like it is, which can be a big contrast to other characters who are more beholden to the rules. Character. Tricksters like Yato can provide some pretty fun writing opportunities in terms of character development and conflict. Cultivating underestimation. A key feature of the trickster is an ability to allow or even encourage underestimation. Yato doesn't really have to try too hard here. When we meet him in Season 1, Episode 1, he briefly appears to be a badass, followed immediately by his regalia quitting on him because he's such a loser. For a bit of context, regalia are basically spirits who serve the gods, often by shifting forms into weapons or armor. Regalia are created when a god uses a spell to bind a spirit to them until and unless the god releases them. Yes, there are definitely some consent issues here, but they're kind of tangential to this particular discussion. The main thing you need to know at the moment is that a god needs at least one regalia in order to fight phantoms, which are spirits that feed off of humans' negative emotions. So the fact that Yato can't seem to keep a regalia isn't a good look for him, and it's dangerous. And yet, he agrees to release his regalia fairly quickly after she asks him to, which tells us a lot about him. He'd rather be defenseless than force a regalia to stay with him. Now, because of the relationship between regalia's emotions and their gods, you could argue that this is actually more of a selfless choice because an unhappy regalia could negatively affect the god they're serving. But you could also interpret it in a more heroic light. At the very least, it gives us a hint that Yato is more than just the tracksuit-wearing dork he appears to be. And this dichotomy between overt goofball and hero becomes increasingly obvious as the series progresses. In Season 1, Episode 2, Yato gets a new regalia named Yukine, an angry young teenager who is less than impressed with Yato from the start. He's disgusted by Yato's bargain bin threads and cheesy attempts to find work by spray painting his phone number on walls and accepting only the traditional 5 yen coin for his efforts. This leads to a really interesting give and take when it comes to Yato's characterization. Because Yukine is right that Yato spends a lot of time wasting money, drinking, and being a fairly cringeworthy god, especially compared to his more stately counterparts. But when the narrative forces Yato to be serious, it's that much more impactful because of the differences between his goofy exterior and his darker, more dangerous side. The juxtaposition between Yato's dorkier side and his more serious side is a really good example of the way a trickster's tendency to be underestimated can tell us a lot about who they are as a character, and about the other characters around them. Progression. Even before he quite realizes it himself, Yato is moving from the person he is to the person he wants to become. Today, Yato is a so-called stray or minor god, but back in the day, he was an extremely dangerous god of calamity, the kind of god humans prayed to when they wanted someone killed. And his sense of self was entirely linked to that identity. So a big portion of the Noragami story is about Yato struggling to reconfigure his identity so he can be the god he actually wants to be, namely someone who is capable of bringing happiness to others. The hints that Yato is capable of this are there from the beginning. All the little ways he shows he's not just a goof, but actually someone who cares deeply about his friends and the people he's responsible for. After Hiyori saves him from the truck, one of the first things Yato does is go visit her in the hospital to make sure she's okay. Yes, he acts like a bit of a weirdo, but he clearly felt a need to look in on a human who did him a favor, even an unnecessary one. He also makes a big, silly show of introducing Hiyori and Yukine to his fellow god Kofuku and her regalia Daikoku, which he later admits wasn't about borrowing money from them so much as it was about making sure Hiyori, in particular, has someone to go to if she's ever in trouble and Yato can't be there for her. And toward the end of season 2, while he's still having occasional moments of silliness, Yato has clearly become the sort of god who recognizes and appreciates strength in others. Although he's essentially being blackmailed into reprising his role as a god of calamity at this point, Yato finds himself wanting to protect Ebisu, a controversial god of fortune, for his own reasons, not just because he's being forced to. While Yato never completely loses his goofball nature, he does evolve into a stronger, more confident character who really values and is prepared to fight for his relationships. And of course, with relationships comes conflict. Conflict. As you might expect, the nature of the trickster makes them prone to butting heads with other characters. After all, if your MO is to keep people from knowing the real you by putting up a facade of incompetence, you're going to annoy the people around you. This can lead to some really interesting and at times frustrating conflict. Hiyori. The plot requires Hiyori to put a lot of faith in Yato from the moment she meets him, and that faith is not exactly warranted at first. Yato doesn't seem particularly reliable, and he doesn't seem to take her situation seriously either. However, this relationship does involve more than just bickering. Hiyori helps Yato form emotional bonds and maybe even take this god thing a little more seriously. She tries to help him during fights, and she's genuinely concerned about his place in the world of gods. Hiyori is also the one who makes Yato the shrine he so desperately wants, and that will help him continue existing. And perhaps most importantly, she figures out Yato's real name, even though he's never told it to anyone, which helps him escape from the underworld. Yato, for his part, becomes increasingly dedicated to Hiyori as someone who helps him save Yukine from a dire situation, someone who inspires him to take responsibility, and someone he wants to make happy. So where's the conflict, you ask? Well, it's less in the personality clashes and more in the nature of the relationship. Because the best solution for Hiyori's soul detachment predicament, as many people tell Yato, would be to sever her ties with the far shore so she can go back to being 100% human. However, that would make her forget everything she's experienced with Yato and Yukine. And so, even though they get several opportunities, neither Yato nor Hiyori can bring themselves to make it happen. Now, this is the sort of conflict that could pop up in any situation like this, regardless of the character's personalities or archetypes. But because Yato is a trickster, and because, as we've discussed, tricksters are often underestimated, other characters don't really understand the lengths to which Yato is prepared to go to stay with Hiyori, whether or not it's the smart thing to do. And they also don't get how or why Hiyori is so dedicated to him and Yukine. And because Yato is usually a giant goof, the moments when he goes totally badass in order to protect Hiyori really stand out, as are the times when she goes all out to protect him. And speaking of going all out for someone, Yukine. The conflict between Yato and Yukine takes up the majority of the season 1 plot, and wow, is it a doozy. Yato makes Yukine his regalia during season 1, episode 2, and while Yukine quickly shows his strength as a powerful weapon, he is not exactly excited about working with Yato. Like everyone else who underestimates Yato, Yukine is unimpressed with Yato's lack of funds, horrible fashion sense, and need to take on odd jobs in order to eat. He'd much rather hang out with Hiyori, who's cuter, not to mention more stable, and more likely to buy them lunch. But the bond between God and regalia is meant to be close-knit, to the point where whatever a regalia is feeling can have a direct impact on the god they serve. Essentially, when a regalia has negative thoughts and feelings, they can negatively affect and even corrupt a god. However, the conflict between Yato and Yukine is really more about a lack of communication. Yukine needs to know things in order to function in his new role as a regalia, and because he's a trickster, Yato is not so great about disseminating that information. Sure, he explains the mind link thing, but he doesn't explain that if a regalia keeps stinging a god with their negative actions, it can literally kill the god, not to mention causing the regalia to be devoured by a phantom. And while Yato does teach Yukine important skills and even compliment him on his good work, he's not great at being the mentor/god figure he ought to be to a new regalia. And his teaching methods can be incredibly harsh, like when he lets Yukine suffer through a difficult series of events at a school in order to help him fully understand that he's no longer alive and connected to the human world in the same way. Yato also hides a lot until the last possible moment. While he admits that he killed Bishamon's regalia thousands of years ago, he doesn't provide Yukine with any context. He also doesn't explain the hold Nora, the regalia he sometimes uses, has over him. This leads to a lot of angst for Yukine, who repeatedly jumps to assumptions about the situation and worries that he's going to be replaced. For what it's worth, Yukine is also a horrible communicator and often doesn't really listen to the things Yato does tell him, so it's not like Yato's the only one to blame here. And yet, the further Yukine moves toward permanent corruption, the more Yato digs his heels in, despite the fact that it could kill him. And even though there's a creepy moment in season 1, episode 5, when Yato tells Hiyori that he's prepared to punish, quote unquote, Yukine, Yato obviously really does want to protect and help him, and goes to ridiculous lengths to do that. And while Yukine can be a self-centered pill at times, he also becomes incredibly loyal to Yato, even going so far as to take a death blow for him. This actually leads to a level up for Yukine, who gets a new look and becomes a blessed vessel, essentially an extremely powerful, very devoted regalia. And this brings us to a common and potentially frustrating element of conflict with tricksters. I've seen the, I think, pretty legitimate argument that if Yato and Yukine would just sit down and talk it out, that would get rid of the vast majority of the conflict. I mean, yeah, there are still personality clashes, but these two really do seem to care about each other, so why are they not just talking? I do think there are some decent reasons for why this doesn't happen right away. The story establishes early on that Yukine is a moody teenager whose human life ended traumatically, and he hasn't figured out a way to really deal with that or accept his new life as a regalia. And Yato, as we've established, is a goofball trickster who defaults to lazy and silly rather than dealing with the darker, more complicated elements of being a god. That said, relying on miscommunication or no communication at all as the main source of your conflict can lead to issues in terms of believability. Like, is it really believable that Yato would put so little effort into explaining the concepts of gods and regalia to someone he knows is a new regalia? Is it believable that Yukine would make so little effort to understand his new position until long after it's caused issues for both him and Yato? There's no right or wrong answer when it comes to this situation, but it does make you think about the pros and cons when it comes to relying on miscommunication for most of your conflict. Bishamon. Let's finish up this section by talking about two other more contentious characters and how their relationships are heavily affected by Yato's status as a trickster. One of these is the war god Bishamon, who's introduced in season 1, episode 5, and becomes a major antagonist for the early part of season 2. Bishamon has a good reason to hate Yato. As I mentioned, he killed her entire house of regalia back in the day, and she's never forgiven him. In fact, she'd very much like to kill him for it. As you might expect, there's a little more to the story than that, and Yato's tendency to play trickster doesn't really help the situation, although it's understandable. In reality, the death of Bishamon's regalia wasn't just because Yato was a god of calamity fulfilling a request. He was specifically fulfilling a request from Bishamon's regalia Kazuma. Kazuma is deeply devoted to Bishamon, and when he saw that there was no way to save his fellow regalia from their corruption, he begged Yato to intervene. Of course, arranging to have your entire house killed isn't exactly something you can come back from in the eyes of the god community. So Yato and Kazuma have basically kept mum about it, leading Bishamon to think that Yato is the bad guy, which she sort of is, but also isn't. The entire conflict between Yato and Bishamon comes down to miscommunication and secrets, not unlike the conflict between Yato and Yukine. And this is another one where your enjoyment may depend on your tolerance for the miscommunication trope and how it plays out here. Yato's trickstery decision not to provide details does make sense, given how cagey we've seen him be about his past. And in this case, spilling the beans would get Kazuma in trouble too, something Yato isn't keen on doing, especially since Kazuma helped with the ritual that saved Yato and Yukine toward the end of season 1. Bishamon's relationship with Yato is all about retribution, and not underestimation so much as disgust and an inability to believe that Yato could be anything other than what Bishamon thinks he is. In other words, Bishamon is definitely caught up in the usual making assumptions about the trickster cycle. It's many, many episodes before the truth comes out, and Bishamon is willing to entertain the idea that Yato could actually be an ally, someone who supports her during difficult situations. By the end of the series, their relationship has evolved into one of rocky respect and tolerance, to the point where Bishamon is actually one of the key players in trying to help Yato escape from the underworld. But only because he helped her during that earlier arc with her regalia, of course. It's not like she cares or anything. Nora. Yato's past with Nora is arguably the reason he picked up the trickster facade in the first place. Nora is the only regalia we see Yato use in the anime, other than Yukine, and she's a bit different. For starters, Nora is really more of a title than a name. It refers to regalia who have multiple masters and therefore multiple names. These regalia are shunned by the denizens of the far shore and only used for dirty work, basically. Nora was Yato's regalia during the time he was known as a god of calamity, and while the details aren't entirely clear in the anime, it's implied that she was raised with Yato by someone called Father, effectively making them siblings. Yato's relationship with Nora, and in particular his conflict with her, is based on her emotional manipulation of him and the way it comes up against his desire to escape his past. Whenever Yato seems like he might be moving on, Nora is there to remind him of what he's done and how his attempts at escape and to form healthier relationships are pointless. What makes Yato's conflict with Nora so interesting is that the trickster facade doesn't really work with her because she knows him and they have a long history together. So she can play on his fears and weaknesses in a way that no other character can. And in addition to the toxic relationship itself, there's the fact that Yato is so hesitant to talk to anyone about it, which causes additional conflict between him and characters like Hiyori and Yukine. A lot of the interactions between Yato and Nora are extremely uncomfortable. They really show how a character's healing can be derailed by someone who has the right weapons. This is also a place where the stark contrast between the silliness of the trickster and their darker side can show us a lot about who that character is, and who the characters around them are. We'll be coming back to Nora in a little bit. Writing takeaways on character. 1. Tricksters give you the opportunity to play with expectations, both the readers and other characters. Making use of how these expectations do and don't line up with reality can lead to more complex, interesting characters and relationships. 2. A trickster thrives on being more than what they seem, which can add layers to the changes they undergo over the course of the story. What is your trickster character trying to achieve, and how can that desire get in their way as they navigate day-to-day life? 3. Conflict is an important element of just about any story, and tricksters offer some interesting built-in opportunities in this area. What a trickster says versus what they do can cause all sorts of fun problems. Just be sure to take a look at any conflicts that rely on miscommunication. As a driving force for trickster-based conflict, miscommunication makes sense, but it can also come across as inauthentic or annoying depending on how it's done. Backstory. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about backstory and how it can be used with a trickster character like Yato. This is kind of a continuation of a discussion from my last video on the Dongwa link click, where we talked about how character backstory can affect what we know about motivation. In the case of Noragami, we do get a fair amount of backstory, and it's slowly developed over the course of the series, which leads to some good tension. But we're also missing some key points, and there are some things that are hidden a little longer than might have been effective. Trauma and coping mechanisms. As I've mentioned, one of the key traits of tricksters is the way they use tricks or misdirection to hide something about their past. They may even be tricking themselves into thinking that their trauma doesn't matter. God of Calamity. For Yato, a lot of the goofy trickster facade is tied up in his past as a god of calamity and his extremely toxic relationship with Nora. Yet rather than explain what's going on, even when asked directly, Yato dissembles or makes himself look like the bad guy without providing any context for other people to understand him. This leads Yato to try to deal with things by himself rather than relying on his friends, which leads to all sorts of problems. For example, when he finally decides to completely cut ties with Nora in Season 2, Episode 8, and it completely backfires, he has no one to turn to because he hasn't told anyone what he was doing. This leaves him stuck in a position of having to return to his abusers and his former identity as a god of calamity. This is actually a really interesting part of the narrative in terms of the trickster characterization, because for about 6 episodes leading up to the end of the series, we lose most of Yato's sillier tendencies and go hard on the darker elements of his character and story. It's a little jarring, frankly, but it shows some really good contrast between the silliness and the real trauma that he's been through. We can clearly see why he's used that silly persona to hide from his past. What we don't see is much explanation of why Yato and Nora were raised the way they were and what father hoped to get out of the situation. At least we don't see that in the anime. So do we need that backstory now? Maybe not, but its absence is noticeable. Nora's. As the god Tenzin explains, Nora's evoke some serious disgust from the gods, who see them as untrustworthy and disgraceful, the so-called strays a god uses to accomplish distasteful tasks. At least according to Tenzin, Noras are more likely to betray you because they have multiple masters, so he, of course, would never use one. And his regalia are also pretty disgusted by the whole concept. But how does Yato feel about it? Well, as we've seen, he does his best to keep his use of Nora a secret, or at the very least to not get into the details, even when Nora shows up to torment the people he cares about. Which sort of makes you wonder, is part of the trauma here the fact that Yato has internalized this idea that Noras are shameful, and therefore he's shameful for using one? This situation reveals another darker element of Yato's personality in that he still, on some level, sees Nora, essentially his surrogate sister, as a tool rather than a person. After all, a big part of the reason he doesn't sever his ties with her is because he's had such a hard time keeping a regalia for any length of time. As long as he has her, he has a tool against the phantoms, unless she's busy with another master at the time, of course. Now, obviously, there's a lot of complicated psychology going on here, and we're only seeing a little bit of it in these episodes. But the conflict stirred up by Noras in general, and this one specifically, is a really good example of how trauma and backstory can create tension for a trickster character. Forgotten. Finally, there are Yato's concerns about being forgotten, which are front and center throughout the whole series. But while it's played for laughs initially with his ridiculous daydreams and 5 yen jobs to do things like find cats and clean bathrooms, it's later shown to be a significant fear for him and a driving factor behind a lot of his actions. One of the most emotional scenes in the series is the one where Hiyori gives Yato a shrine she made for him. It's small and crude, but the moment where he uncharacteristically starts crying as he holds it shows just how important it is to him to feel that he won't be forgotten, and that someone went to all the trouble of making sure he knew that. This is actually pretty important, given the context brought up in Season 2, Episode 8, when we get a brief flashback of someone, probably Father, telling him that he doesn't need a shrine, which led Yato to assume he'd never be able to have one. There's also an indication that part of the reason he's forced to go back to Nora and Father is that they provide a so-called lifeline, which is what allows him to continue to exist even without followers. Although we don't get any further explanation of this in the anime. So when Hiyori makes him a shrine, it might seem kind of silly, but it's actually a really important part of Yato's healing process. It helps him see that maybe he's not the kind of god who's easily forgotten, even if his past made him think that was the case. Context. However, as I've been kind of hinting at, there are certain situations in which lacking backstory leads to lacking what's kind of important context. Afraid of the dark. When Yato first makes Yukine into a regalia, he catches a glimpse of Yukine's human past. The audience is given the sense that it must have been pretty awful, since seeing it makes Yato cry. But we never learn any of the details or how Yukine feels about it, beyond a general destructive anger about no longer being alive, as evidenced by his actions in Season 1, Episode 8. Which is kind of too bad, because having that context might have made it a little easier to understand where Yukine was coming from, beyond just he's a moody teenager and his death was rough. And yes, I do know that we get more of this information in the manga. But remember, we're talking about the anime here, so this means that anime-only folks are missing some really important context in terms of why a main character is acting the way he is. That said, we do get one other important detail. In Season 1, Episode 5, when Yukine is temporarily staying with Hiyori, Yato shows up and warns Hiyori to be mindful of Yukine's fear of the dark. Based on context, we can assume this has something to do with Yukine's past, but again, we're never given any more explanation. I suspect this is a situation where the showrunners intended to get to that information later, or maybe the manga hadn't explored it yet. But the fact that we're missing important backstory related to Yukine's death makes him kind of harder to connect with as a character, which is too bad. Villain or victim? I haven't really spent a lot of time going into Nora's backstory and motivation because we don't really know a lot about them in the anime. It's not unreasonable to deduce that Nora might also be a victim of father's emotional abuse, given the way she responds to him. But because we don't have a lot of details about the backstory between her, Yato, and father, that relationship doesn't really have the depth that it could. Nora's dishing of emotional abuse, telling Yato he's easily forgotten, blaming him for the fact that she's a Nora, could easily be a technique she learned from father specifically to manipulate Yato. Or it could be a tactic she adopted out of fear of abandonment. Either way, it's understandable that she would want to stay with the brother figure she grew up with. However, because we don't know the details of that relationship or how it became so toxic, it's hard to get a handle on who Nora really is and what she really wants. When Yato is finally able to break ties with her, thanks to support from Yukine and Hiyori, it's meaningful because of what we know about those characters and how they've evolved. But it doesn't tell us much about why exactly Nora acted the way she did throughout the series, beyond the fact that she was apparently following Father's orders. And the post-credits scene still leaves a lot open in terms of Father's motivations, probably because there was going to be another season at some point. Again, this is a situation where I assume we're lacking backstory simply because the show didn't have enough time to adapt everything. But it does give us the opportunity to consider when and how to reveal backstory and what kind of impact that might have had on the story as a whole. Like, would knowing more about Yukine's backstory have made him a more palatable character for audience members who found him annoying? Would knowing more about Father's treatment of both Nora and Yato have given that relationship a little more depth? Even leaving aside the adaptation issues, it makes sense that a trickster-centric story wouldn't reveal all of the backstory all at once. Secrets can be a really good way to build drama. But as I mentioned before, backstory can be a really great tool for revealing more about character motivations and relationships. If we're missing key elements of those things, it may not matter how much great tension you're building with all those secrets because your audience may just get annoyed that they don't know things they need to know. Writing takeaways on backstory. 1. A trickster character often uses goofiness to hide a troubled past. This can be a great opportunity to explore trauma or whatever a character might choose to avoid having to deal with. 2. It's also worth considering the backstories and emotional stressors of the characters around the trickster. Are they impacted by the trickster's decisions about when to reveal information? Are their hangups affecting the trickster's actions? Backstory can affect more than just the individual it belongs to. 3. It makes sense for a trickster character to want to hide parts of their backstory, but be sure your audience is still getting all the info they need to fully understand character choices and personality traits. Building tension through secrets can be super fun. However, you don't want your audience to miss out on key character or plot points that might help them better understand the story. Conclusion. So, let's review what we've learned today, shall we? 1. Using tropes and archetypes is a good way to present basic storytelling elements that appeal to your ideal readers. Of course, you want to put your own spin on things, but there's no need to be afraid they'll turn into cliches so long as you're writing them in a realistic, multifaceted way. 2. The trickster archetype is familiar and fun, offering a wide variety of opportunities to connect with readers looking for a blend of funny and insightful, and potentially significant badassery, too. 3. Using a trickster character is a great way to mess with both the readers' and other characters' expectations. There's something universal about the frustration that comes with feeling underestimated and wanting people to see you for who you really are. 4. Tricksters come with their own unique approach to conflict that often hinges on their inability to speak openly and honestly in certain situations. You'll want to avoid artificial reliance on the miscommunication trope, of course, but watching a trickster and the people around them struggle with authentic relationships can be really interesting and engaging for your readers. 5. Backstory is key to any story. It's a great way to provide context and help your readers understand the characters and their motivations. Tricksters provide an opportunity to complicate backstory, usually by hiding some sort of trauma they're not ready to deal with. 6. Keeping a trickster's backstory secret has its merits, but it's important to determine when and how to reveal backstory and related information so you're not causing your audience to miss out on important context. That's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you've seen Noragami and have thoughts on the writing, I would love to chat in the comments. Also, as always, feel free to leave your recs for other anime to cover in this series. And if you like stories about magical mayhem and characters who aren't what they appear to be, you may want to check out my urban fantasy trilogy, the Compound series. It's got cranky empaths, magical conspiracies, and a little bit of queer romance. Books 1 and 2 are available in ebook and paperback, and book 3 is tentatively scheduled for release in late 2024. More information on that is also below. Thanks again for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you in the next video.